That's it.
There is a lot of recording equipment up here. But if I press the buttons right, it all should work. So thank you for coming. As Mick said, this is the first in a series of lectures spread out over the course of the academic year. I think these first four make a kind of complete unit by themselves, and then the next three are a kind of unit. And then we'll see whether there's anything left to say. The general aim of the lectures is to elaborate a sort of conversation between some bodies of recent art and G.W.F. Hegel's aesthetics, which are widely... Can't hear me?
It's
Too boomy? Am I too loud?
See what you like without it.
Can you hear me if I talk like this? Not so much.
Try that.
How's that?
Rubbish.
Put this down lower?
Yeah. What about that?
Is that okay?
Let's try it.
I'll try to speak up. I'll move it up a little. Try that? Okay, and no boom? Okay. I see, it's when I lean forward it booms. I will try not to lean forward. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, bunch of lectures, conversation between Hegel and a number of instances of recent art, drawing very much on what's available in English, that is, Hegel's lectures on fine art in the Knox translation. I'll come back to that in just a second. And this first lecture is essentially orientational, both in relation to the project as a whole, but more specifically in relation to Hegelian argument, as it's going to matter for the lectures that follow. So it's kind of dry stuff for a Friday night, and the pictures are mostly of text. Looking at the project more largely, the artists I'm going to be considering, Daniel Buren, Richard Serra, Eva Hess, Robert Smithson, Peter Eisenman, and Louise Lawler, are all pretty well-established figures. Lawler may be something of an exception in this regard. That she belonged to this project was sort of a kind of late surprise for me. All of them have considerable and valuable bodies of criticism attached to their work. And I don't feel as if I am in the position of having to make any particular case for the value or interest of their work. And I don't think we lack fundamentally sound accounts of their work. We have those. So whatever novelty there is in these lectures lies quite specifically in the encounter with Hegel and bringing these things together. Serra, Hess, and Smithson all figured early on in claims to a particular thing called post-minimalism, but I think the whole bundle of them can be considered broadly post-minimalist. That's certainly the way I'm going to talk about them. Again, Lawler seems a little late for that, but and I take it that means that I'm interested in them insofar as they represent a range of practices that emerge and take part of their sense of their condition and of the particular difficulties and transformations possible to art, take all of that from the kinds of arguments that arise around minimalism, modernist medium specificity, and so on in American art in the 60s. And of course, the key text for that continues to be Michael Fried's essay, Art and Objecthood, so you'll not be surprised that a couple of lectures in, some attention is going to be given to that essay. I mentioned that I'll be referring to and quoting from the Knox translation of Hegel's lectures on fine art. Not so long ago, that would have been merely a bit of useful but hardly necessary bibliographic information. But these days, it marks a particular choice, and in my case, a particular limitation, so I just want to say a word about that. As with much of the work we attribute to him, Hegel did not publish his work on aesthetics during his lifetime. The text that we have in English is a translation of an early slightly later, further amended, long standard compilation of Hegel's notes for his lectures and student transcripts from courses that he gave in 1823, 1826, and 1828-29. In recent years, German scholars have been bringing out editions of those individual courses, and in the process, they've been discovering a lot of interesting things about how the lectures changed over time, and also about how much the early editor of all this, H.G. Hoffo, himself contributed to the text. So you might say, the text I'm referring to is getting less stable all the time. There are interesting things going on in and around Hegel's philosophy of art, and they're largely beyond the reach of my barely serviceable German. So that's just a fact you should know about what you're hearing. I described the object of these lectures as attempting to elaborate a conversation between Hegel's work and that of a certain number of artists who I hope can stand well for at least a certain moment in the recent history of art. I think they stand for something larger than that, but we'll see how that works out. But the subtitle given for the series on the flyers actually says Hegelian Readings in Recent Art, using a rather different and narrower word than conversation, this word reading. And I actually slipped up a bit with this. The actual title in my files is Hegelian Lectures in Recent Art, partly because I wanted both the direct echo of Hegel's own title and the punning capacity of the word lecture to refer both to an oral performance by a certain kind of academic, and then closer to the word's actual Latin roots, the meaning of reading. With either lecture or reading, I wanted that little preposition in, rather than the more usual of Hegelian readings of recent art, to create a certain ambiguity as between readings of some recent art from, so to speak, Hegel's point of view, and readings of Hegel carried out by the art. It's that two-wayness that the word conversation, I suppose, foregrounds a bit, but it does so at some cost to the specificity of the word reading, and that specificity is very important to the argument as a whole. You may also have noticed on the flyer that this evening's lecture is entitled Reading, Hegel, and the first of the spring lectures, the February lectures, is entitled Hess, Reading. And you're probably entitled to take several things out of that. It's meant to underline that the work of reading moves in both directions. Its particular form may suggest, I think probably rightly, that the opening lectures you'll hear in the next 2 weeks from Buren and Sarah stay fairly close to being Hegelian readings of their work, while the subsequent lectures, the reverse flow, the sense of Hesse reading Hegel, or Smithson reading Hegel, will be more apparent. And finally, I just noticed for the moment that in both titles, a comma is there, as it were, to make a kind of hitch in the more normal phrase, Hegel reading, Hess reading. The claim that some particular body of artistic work does something worth calling reading, whether of Hegel or of anything else, is, I suppose, a bit peculiar, particularly when it's not supported, as it will not be in these talks, by some view about what the artist, him or herself, might actually have read. Smithson is probably the only artist in the bunch one can imagine having read Hegel. So you may feel now, and you may feel when these lectures are all done, that it has to be a metaphor of some kind. If it seems to you the right metaphor, one that usefully gets at the actual intelligence of the work, that's fine with me. But I also hope by the time I'm done, you'll have some reason to think it can't be simply a metaphor. So that's the general overview of the whole thing. I want to turn now to the business of reading Hegel. In translation, Hegel's aesthetics run to more than 1,200 pages spread out across 2 volumes. For a long time, I think pretty much the only bit of this that ever got read by anyone other than real Hegel specialists was some usually pretty severely abridged version of its 90-page introduction, which gives a small amount of preliminary argument, a sort of schematic overview of the whole thing, and a certain notable prominence to the most well-known of Hegel's claims, that art is now for us a thing of the past. That remark will get various kinds of attention as the lectures develop, so I'm not going to dwell on it now. Instead, I want to start simply by taking note of the evident tension between the kinds of schematic overview one can take out of that introduction and the 1,200 heavily exampled pages that are the actual stuff of Hegel's lectures on fine art. Hegel is famously the philosopher of what he himself called the system, which has meant, among other things, that it's pretty much always possible to peel schematic overviews off of it, as if they were adequately substituted for the actual thinking, rather than simply being a kind of effect of it. In some cases, and I'm thinking here particularly of Hegel's philosophy of history, Hegel seems to do this himself. He just peels the schematic layer off and sort of runs some stuff through it, and you end up with a book that is really pretty much devoid of interest. But in his major works, the Phenomenology of Spirit, the Logic, the Philosophy of Right, and I'd certainly say the Lectures on Fine Art, they're all built of firmer and more fully worked stuff, which is why it's actually worth reading the 1,200 pages. There's stuff going on in there all the time. Now, that's not to say that the schematic aspects of Hegel's way of working is without its usefulness. Indeed, I'm going to make fairly extensive use of it throughout these lectures, primarily in the form of diagrams, for which I admit to a pronounced weakness, that you may not all share, but I hope they'll be useful in sort of locating discussions, showing large-scale relations across the argument, and so on. In preparation for and sort of compensation for those moments, what I want to do in the bulk of tonight's talk is explore what in Hegelian argument actually creates these schematic effects, allows you to draw diagrams of the argument. So I'm going to try and look at how Hegelian argument actually works by looking at a couple of pages well away from the philosophy of art in Hegel's first major work, The Phenomenology of Spirit. That's the handout you've got, the pages I'm going to be working on. And in that, his discussion of what he calls the speculative proposition. This is a term that doesn't recur in Hegel's later work, and some Hegel scholars are sort of inclined to discount it, but I take it to be a fully serious elaboration of the kind of argument on which his work depends throughout. And I think it's a particularly interesting formulation because by the time we get to the end of it, we will land, in effect, right in the middle of the philosophy of art. So these pages come in the midst of a fairly demanding stretch of the Phenomenology's preface, which is itself a pretty notoriously difficult bit of writing. And I'm going to start from a rather odd place, and I imagine if you glanced at your handout, it's probably a place you grabbed at right away, where Hegel paused to take note. And I'm going to put this up on the screen here with the yellow highlight moving around as I move around. I'm trying not to bob and weave, but I'm not doing it very well. So I'm starting from this place where Hegel pauses to take note of, and I quote, complaints regarding the unintelligibility of philosophical writing from individuals who otherwise possess the educational requirements for understanding them. And then more particularly of the complaint, again I quote, that so much has to be read over and over before it can be understood. I don't expect that this passage is quoted a whole lot in the literature on Hegel. And if I'm right about that, it's presumably both because it doesn't, either in itself or in comparison to the passages that immediately precede or follow it, appear to be of any real importance, some sort of minor rhetorical flourish that lets Hegel push his argument a bit further, but is actually not part of it. And I think it also would not get much attention because the complaints it addresses seem so familiar and so much of the time so recognizably our own. But that's, of course, maybe a good enough reason to start by attending to it. The admission of philosophy's difficulty has in fact its own history, in which Hegel and especially the phenomenology play an interestingly special role. In Kant, for example, a character called the reader is justified in making demands on the form of a philosophical investigation, justified in demanding that it produce certainty, that it be clear both logically and in terms of exemplification. But examples, Kant also feels, are finally necessary only for a popular aim for which his work could never be made suitable in any case. Real experts in this science do not have so much need for things to be made easy for them. Philosophic argument, according to Kant, just is difficult business. It's not for everyone and it's not presentable to everyone. For those writing in Kant's wake, this sense of a real and quite possibly justifiable gap between the ordinary person or consciousness and the philosopher or the work of philosophy became only ever more explicit and more problematic. Schelling, for example, writes in 1802, "It's inconceivable why philosophy should be obliged to be considerate of incapacity. It's rather appropriate to cut off philosophy sharply and to isolate it on all sides from common cognition in such a way that no path or pavement can lead from common cognition to philosophy. Here begins philosophy, and whoever is not already there or afraid to reach this point, let him stay away or flee back." This is clearly, an assertion of the seriously esoteric nature of philosophic knowledge, the real, possibly quite bottomless gulf between common cognition, ordinary persons, and philosophy or the philosopher. It's also not exactly an untroubled assertion of all that. He says the barrier is perhaps only a product of common cognition's fear. He also suggests that it may be that philosophy has or should isolate itself from, even fortify itself against ordinary consciousness. The barrier isn't there, it needs to be constructed. That ambivalence is very much of this post-Kantian moment. I owe my knowledge of Schelling's remark to William Bristow's really good recent book, Hegel and the Transformation of Philosophical Critique, where he uses it to underline Hegel's holding essentially the same view at that same time. But crucially, this is not the view informing this remark in the Phenomenology. This remark is importantly an acknowledgement. It's a kind of irritated one, but an acknowledgement nonetheless of the justice of the common reader's complaint. It's because it is such an acknowledgement that it can function as a sort of pivot between the account of the speculative proposition by which it has been preceded in paragraph 61 and the more summary remarks about the form and stakes of philosophical writing that follow in paragraph 64. It's probably worth thinking a little bit about how remarks of this general order become possible and even ordinary. They have certain conditions that have to be in place, and the most general of which is the distinctively modern claim by the reader to a certain kind of autonomy and to be able to make legitimate demands, including, importantly for our purposes, a demand for philosophical critique, epistemological critique, as a kind of defense against philosophic dogmatism. That's the demand Kant's work meant to meet, and the worry shared by by Schelling and the young Hegel, and by a whole generation of post-Kantian thinkers, is that if you meet this demand coming from the ordinary consciousness, you have in effect already handled metaphysics over to subjectivism. You've given everything over to the ordinary subject. The phenomenology seen from this angle is a way out of an apparent impasse. On the one hand, it grants, as Bristow puts it in his book, that metaphysical objectivity, whatever its nature and source, cannot simply determine me independently of my relating to it, that is, independently of my recognition of and insight into its authority. It can't be esoteric. It can't place itself away from me. And on the other hand, the phenomenology actively places this subject, me, at stake within the progressive and ultimately transformative unfolding of my relation to it. So this moment in which I am demanding that philosophy make itself clear is not preliminary to doing philosophy. It is something that unfolds in the doing of philosophy in which I am involved from the beginning. As Hegel puts it earlier in this same preface, the individual has the right to demand that philosophy should at least provide him with a ladder to its standpoint, should show him this standpoint within himself. And what matters here is that the ladder is not an external aid to the reader, but internal to him or her, discoverable as something already there. That's what the phenomenology is trying to do, is help you discover in you the ladder that is already your relation to philosophy. The most general marker of this in the phenomenology is the presence in its philosophic vocabulary of something postulated as for us, we, readers, right? Alongside, at first, and then entering into increasingly complex relations with such more normal philosophic terms as in itself, for itself, and so on. We are in the phenomenology. It remarks on our reading of it, and that's also what this little aside that I'm starting from is doing in its own way. As I mentioned, Kant does sometimes invoke a figure that goes under the name of reader. He writes, for example, about something he's just said, "While I am writing this, I believe I perceive in the face of the reader an indignation mixed with contempt at claims that are apparently so pretentious and immodest." But Kant's reader does not, in any particular sense, read. It attends to claims, it demands clarity, has some claim on exemplification, but all these bear on what one might call the exposition of a thought or an argument, rather than any really direct engagement with a text. Kant's reader follows an argument that the text, it's tempting to say, merely conveys. The real object there is this argument, which is an intellectual thing. Hegel's reader is, by contrast, first of all, engaged with a text, and its complaint is explicitly the complaint of someone reading a text, that sentences have to be gone over and over to be understood. So Hegel's admission of the justice of this complaint is a way of insisting on what of his argument belongs irreducibly to writing, or more broadly, to language. He's similarly attentive to his auditors in his lecture courses. This awareness or alertness to reading is presumably not unique to Hegel, and one can think of roughly contemporary matters as various as the new or renewed interest in interpretation, Fichte's grounding of copyright in the property a writer holds in a text's expressive form, the romantic emphasis on poetic apostrophe addressed to the reader, the emergence of new ways of teaching children to read, and of a new type of university with a new prominence for the professor as lecturer. Right? So many bits of a kind of recognizably modern background against which Hegel's remark finds a large part of its obviousness, its familiarity to our ears. What I hope will be interesting to catch it as it also connects with the actual argument of the phenomenology. I want to work my way back around to this readerly aside by looking at the first of the two passages hinged around it. Section 61, paragraph 61, is the culmination of a pretty sustained discussion of method that repeatedly works off of the contrast between what Hegel calls common understanding and the terms of speculative argument, or as we now more easily say, Hegelian dialectic. And it's working to develop an account of the inner structure of the logical proposition or sentence. I think I'll wait for them to finish killing the microphone. Oh, okay. This is a little odd. The general point of this paragraph is that if we take the logical subject of a proposition to be fixed in advance, we'll never be able to move beyond that subject. Right? The sentence actually goes nowhere. It starts with a subject, it ends there. Whereas if we see how that subject is itself at stake in the proposition, that it otherwise appears merely to anchor, we can begin to grasp how the argument actually moves, how the sentence makes a difference. We're talking, as the examples in the next paragraph make clear, about sentences like God is being, or the actual is the universal. We're just talking about the form of these sentences, so we don't have to worry about why we would want to say them. And the summary of his discussion reads, you've got this in front of you, formally, what has been said can be expressed thus. The general nature of the judgment or proposition, which involves the distinction of subject and predicate, is destroyed by the speculative proposition, and the proposition of identity, which the former becomes, contains the counterthrust against that subject-predicate relationship. This conflict between the general form of a proposition and the unity of the notion, and for the phrase unity of the notion, you can say what the sentence actually means to show. Right? This conflict between the general form of a proposition and the unity of the notion which destroys it is similar to the conflict that occurs in rhythm between meter and accent. Rhythm results from the floating center and the unification of the two. So too, in the philosophical proposition, the identification of subject and predicate is not meant to destroy the difference between them, which the form of the proposition expresses. Their unity, rather, is meant to emerge as a harmony. Right? I want to work over that a little bit. So we've got a sentence, the actual is the universal. A is, or as we sometimes put it, A equals A. In arithmetic, this is easy. 8 equals 15 minus 7, which reduces to 8 equals 8. A equals A. But that's presumably not what we want out of the sentence, the actual is the universal, not what the sentence means to show. It doesn't reduce to the actual is the actual. And everything is lost if we find a way to factor the word universal out. Taken that way, the sentence would assert a difference only in order to reduce it to an identity, whereas Hegel's point is that we have to sustain that difference across the reduction in order to get at the particular way the sentence's terms are bound to each other precisely by their difference. In arithmetic, we can say 8 equals 15 minus 7, or 15 minus 7 equals 8, and it all's the same. But sentences don't commute that way. The actual is the universal, and the universal is the actual are not the same, do not mean the same, and the real sense of both, what Hegel calls the unity of the notion, the same that they do mean to say, is inseparable from their interference with one another. It's going to take at least one more sentence to say that, which is why, so to speak, thinking unfolds in time, while calculation merely happens at one speed or another. Speculative argument works through propositions as their subjects and predicates loop through themselves to generate new subjects for further propositions. So famously, in the opening of the logic, being is nothing, and nothing is being, each vanishing, Hegel says, immediately into the other, and the truth of that movement is becoming, in which both are distinguished, but by a difference which has equally immediately resolved itself, and which is accordingly the subject of Hegel's next sentence. Start being is nothing, nothing is being, and now we've got becoming as our subject. And we're off and, as it were, dialectically running. And of course, it is anything but an accident that logic begins for Hegel by discovering becoming at the heart of being. That's what it's really all about. Some sentences may strike us as having arithmetic kinds of simplicity. That's green, for example. In the phenomenology, it's precisely sentences of this sort that start setting things in motion. And what they set in motion is the whole of the phenomenology, which is in a sense nothing more than the explication of that sentence that seemed so simple. There is, in the paragraph we've been looking at, a dash. Yes. Setting off its second sentence. It actually, I skipped it when I read it aloud, but it reads, dash this conflict. Right? It's not exactly clear why that should be there. The sentence that follows seems a continuation of the one before it. But the dash has the effect of a kind of check. It brings things up a bit short before it plunges on. Something similar happens at the end of the next paragraph, which is mostly devoted to illustrating the statement I've just been looking at. Here, Hegel writes, thinking, or I should say, dash here, thinking therefore loses the firm objective basis it had in the subject when, in the predicate, it does not return into itself but into the subject of the content. And this is the immediate stage on which Hegel gives voice to the reader's complaint. This abnormal inhibition of thought. You might say that's what the dashes are marking, is this abnormal inhibition of thought, the little thing that hauls you up for a second, a moment of check and something like repetition. It's work that my comma's doing in those titles I remarked on earlier. This abnormal inhibition of thought is in large measure the source of the complaints regarding the unintelligibility of philosophical writings. The exposition has, to this point, been, so to speak, out there, in the sentences and propositions, in what and how they mean, more or less, on their own. But of course, what's being described there is clearly something like an act of writing, how one sentence produces another. Right? Being is nothing, nothing is being, becoming. And it's an act of writing that's inseparable from a kind of reading that Hegel seems to treat as internal to the proposition, so that the external reader of such sentences is entirely correct that their reading can't be separated from their rereading. Right? What's going on in the sentence is itself something that calls for rereading on the part of the reader. Again, 8 equals 15 minus 7 is true apart from a reading of it, from any reader or reading of it. The actual is the universal doesn't find its truth apart from a reading of it that will unfold at once as rereading and rewriting. Hegel's turn to the complaining reader allows him to make this external dimension of the speculative proposition fully explicit. It also allows him to characterize the underlying point significantly differently, so that what begins as an aside returns into the actual argument. He writes, the philosophical proposition, since it is a proposition, leads one to believe that the usual subject-predicate relation obtains, as well as the usual attitude towards knowing. But the philosophical content destroys this attitude and this opinion. We learn by experience that we meant something other than we meant to mean, and this correction of our meaning compels our knowing to go back to the proposition and understand it in some other way. Probably the first thing worth noticing in that remark is it's making clear that the philosophical or speculative proposition doesn't look different from the ordinary proposition. It is an ordinary proposition. There's no special class of sentences that are somehow speculative as opposed to ordinary. Rather, the speculative proposition just is the ordinary proposition in its actual meaning, its scansion or reading of itself. And the difference this makes is evident in the sentence that follows it, or in how one gets, reading or writing, reading and writing, to that next sentence. It's then also worth noticing how this whole paragraph has worked its way from individuals, presumed to be in some sense outside of Hegel's writing, through a passing invocation of a one, who clearly also approaches the text from the outside, to a we, that is evidently both Hegel writing and the reader of that writing, jointly taken as subjects of a certain experience, and indeed of experience as such. Experience, Hegel writes early in their preface, is the name we give to just this movement in which the immediate, the unexperienced, the abstract, becomes alienated from itself and then returns to itself from this alienation, and is only then revealed for the first time in its actuality and truth. Experience, as Hegel understands it, is not given. It's not simply what befalls one, but it's something that emerges only through and as the articulation, the reading, the rewriting of it, and so it's revealed for the first time only in its repetition. And I'm going to come back to this question of experience in some of the later lectures in much more concrete and fleshed out ways. It's just this kind of repetition that binds together the enchained subjective genitives of the science of the experience of consciousness that is the phenomenology of spirit, which necessarily takes the form of a text written as at once subject and object of reading. The word form that I just used, takes the form of a text, is important here. It's more important, for example, than in Kant's use in the passage I read earlier, because Hegel's issue is precisely about how the demands of grammar necessarily place meaning and its medium, expression and intention, at odds with one another. And it's this tension that gives rise to the interesting surge of aesthetic terms like rhythm, meter, and accent in the discussion of the general nature of the judgment or proposition in paragraph 61 that we looked at, and more significantly, to the last word of this whole development in paragraph 64, where Hegel writes, "Only a philosophical exposition that rigidly excludes the usual way of relating the parts of a proposition could achieve the goal of plasticity." And that's a really, I think, deeply fascinating word to have emerge there. I'd say for Kant, presumably the goal of philosophic writing should be to achieve clarity. You can see through it to the thought. For Hegel, the goal of philosophical exposition is what he calls plasticity. Obviously, I want to return to that word, but before I do it, and because I've dragged you through a difficult bunch of stuff, I want to pause and just try and take note of some very general points. I told you there'd be diagrams. The first is that the role of repetition in these formulations gives rise fairly naturally to several closely related ways of figuring the general progress and structure of Hegelian argument. Figures for the shape of systematic argument, and so also figures for the shape of what Hegel calls the system. And Hegel draws on these figures frequently in his writings. The first and simplest is, of course, the circle. And its most obvious variants are the helix, something that lets you imagine the way the subject of a given proposition can be said to return again at a higher level. Right? You work through it, you come out, and it comes back again in a new, higher form. Right? Projected onto two dimensions, that helix can be rendered as a kind of sine wave. And the spiral, which perhaps gives a better feeling for the way in which this kind of movement entails a continuing opening out as the subject repeatedly transforms itself beyond its starting point. Possibly useful related geometrical figures, and I put this up here because they will come up fairly soon as we go along, can be found in the universe of conic sections, parabolas, hyperbolas, ellipses, shapes like that. More mechanical figures that I imagine are unknown to Hegel, I can't think of any place they show up in him, but are clearly related to his way of talking about things like the circle of circles, and are kind of useful props for thinking about how arguments end up nested inside one another as Hegel's argument unfolds, can be found in the spirograph, other kids' toys like that, toys in which the rapid turning of one gear causes the slower turning of a larger gear, or in which the conjoint turning of several gears allows the tracing out of complex repetitive patterns. Even in writing out such a list of diagrammatic imaginative props, it's hard to avoid another rather different figure that Hegel makes use of himself, among other places, in the introduction to the lecture on fine arts, when he writes, quote, "Philosophy has to unfold and prove the object according to the necessity of its own inner nature." Right? And these sentences unfold into each other as a part of what I've been trying to talk about. Something complex gets laid out along the lines of its articulation. So I found some folding toys, too. It may strike some of you who are interested in these kind of things that contemporary thought has not necessarily moved very far from this field of figures. We're still caught up in it in interesting ways. Some of these diagrams will feel thin, others may be useful reminders of what in the Hegelian text can at times seem to have an almost material thickness to it. The quote I just gave you, philosophy has to unfold and prove the object according to the necessity of its own inner nature, opens up another highly general point about what Hegelian argument finally does. It says that philosophy proves its object. It doesn't say that it proves that the object is one thing or another, but simply that it proves the object. Proves, one might say, that it is an object, or that it is the object one takes it to be. I imagine relatable, ordinary English senses might include proofing a print, checking it against itself, or proofing a dough, giving it the time to become itself. Hegelian arguments find their conclusions in such proof or disproof. Absolute knowledge is knowledge proved, proofed, fully unfolded, shown to have found its end in itself across its manifold transformations. Consciousness, the subject of the phenomenology's opening arguments, works its way through several sentences, as we might say. Sentences like consciousness is sense certainty, consciousness is perception, consciousness is understanding, before giving way, finding its disproof in self-consciousness, which now becomes the subject of sentences that consciousness can no longer sustain, until it too finds its disproof in reason. And all of these are episodes within the workings of what we can imagine as a much longer sentence that has knowledge as its subject, and which does finally return to itself fully unfolded, proven and proofed against collapse. It's worth noticing that proof and disproof in this sense are not simple alternatives to one another. Consciousness finds its proof, its limits, in its disproof. Hegel's lectures on fine art are in this sense the proof of art. And like consciousness in the phenomenology, art finds its proof ultimately as its disproof, in its giving way to another subject, philosophy. So in a first diagram here, we have art's history as a finely unhappy arc, whose happier continuation lies beyond it in philosophy. So the diagram is probably better done upside down, right? And you'll notice this means that art's origins don't lie within it either. They also lie outside it. It's the between of two things that are more real, in some sense, than it is. If we go on to take into account that art has its own internal movements of rise and fall, of being more and less itself, our diagram start to look like this. This is then one way of picking up on Hegel's remark about art being a thing of the past. Hegel's writing over there where it says philosophy, and behind him, art has risen and fallen and produced the happy ending of philosophy. We're going to see other ways of looking at that before we're done. So. Okay. Let me return now to the word plasticity. The phenomenology doesn't offer any further help with that word. It doesn't arise again in the phenomenology, and notably doesn't arise in its pretty undeveloped discussion of art. The philosophy of mind, characterization of art as a transfiguration of what it calls the natural immediacy of the linguistic sign into the fullness of expression, you might say that implicitly understands the arts to be broadly formative, plastic, a matter of things that are above all made, shaped one way or another, which means, for example, that worries about perception, the image, visuality, and so on, a lot of the ways we normally begin our talk about art now, figure for Hegel at best in passing, and certainly offer no starting point for thinking about either art in general or the individual arts in their particularity. This view is continued and strongly fleshed out by the lectures on fine art. But even here, the term plastic only really comes into its own in Hegel's discussion of classical sculpture. It's from this point that one can see that the use of the term in the phenomenology intends to secure for Hegel's own writing a status equivalent to, that is, as a dialectical repetition of, the expressive presence of Greek sculpture. You can get a decent feel for what this means by noticing just how far his description of what matters in classical sculpture could pass equally well as a description of what fully achieved philosophical exposition should look like. He writes, each part is completely there, independently and in its own peculiar character, while all the same, owing to the full richness of the transitions. He's talking about sculpture, but transition is a very important technical word in Hegelian argument. Owing to the full richness of the transitions, it remains in firm connection not only with its immediate neighbor, but with the whole. Consequently, the shape is perfectly animated at every point. Even the minutest detail has its purpose. Everything has its own particular character, its own difference, its own distinguishing mark, and yet it remains in continual flux, counts and lives only in the whole. If you had that passage before you as a kind of blind test, choosing it whether it came from the Phenomenology, the Encyclopedia, or the Lectures on Fine Art would be almost impossible. The sculpted gods, as Hegel understands them, are all outwardness and externality. As he puts it at one point, classical beauty has for its inner being the free independent meaning, i.e. not a meaning of this or that, but what means itself, and therefore intimates itself. In this objectivity of itself, it has then the form of externality. Or again, the spirit appears entirely immersed in its external form, and yet at the same time emerged thence into itself. The thence there is really interesting. The Greek gods have no selves apart from their outward forms. That's where what counts as the self is, and they are devoid of interiority. The Greek gods themselves are, Hegel says, plastic, and it's because they are plastic in this way that they find their fullest realization in sculpture, which is likewise all outside, all external, wholly plastic. This fusion of form and content is in principle total, so that one can say the gods would not, in fact, exist were they not inherently sculptural. Greek religion, Hegel says, is the religion of art itself. It's hardly surprising then that the phenomenology's description of logical form has itself a distinctly sculptural ring. The self-moving concrete shape, he writes, and he's talking now about propositions, argument, that kind of stuff. The self-moving concrete shape makes itself into a simple determinateness. In so doing, it raises itself to logical form and exists in its essentiality. Its concrete existence just is this movement and is directly a logical existence. It has no internal stuff to it. It is for this reason unnecessary to clothe the content in external formalism. It's almost like Hegel is getting drawn into these arguments about the nude in sculpture. The content is in its very nature the transition into such formalism, but a formalism which ceases to be external since the form is the innate development of the concrete content itself. It's not outside anything. It is the outside. These are not simply formal facts for Hegel. Greek sculpture, in its externality, in its gathering of a people around itself, creates the Greek social fact, allows them to recognize themselves, and grants them the first-person plural of we Greeks. That's what these gods do. Just as Hegel imagines, his achieved philosophical system enables our recognition of ourselves as fully human. We stand to the completed system as the Greeks stood to their sculpture. If we take these remarks to be a guide to the sense of Hegel's claim about the plastic goal of philosophical exposition, so the rhyming of sculpture and philosophy here, we will say that he imagines no movement of thought beyond or beneath or inside language, but simply, and obviously then not so simply, the writing of words and sentences that bear their meaning not within themselves, but on, as it were, their outside. That's what he thinks his writing does. Words and sentences that mean what they say. That's importantly not the same as saying what they mean, because to mean what you say is to be exposed without reserve. If I imagine my business to be saying what I mean, I can always withdraw my words in favor of a meaning I recognize or imagine as still unexpressed. I can take back the words. As, and now I'm glimpsing a little bit ahead, when Tony Smith says in the very midst of his description of his celebrated drive on the unfinished New Jersey Turnpike, there's no way you can frame it, you just have to experience it. The meaning is being withdrawn from the saying, thus relegating his experience precisely to what Hegel would call the unexperienced or the abstract. When I mean what I say, I'm obliged by what I say. I'm published. I'm exposed to reading. In putting things this way, I've already implicitly filled the blank space in our diagram, because we've taken it that what is at stake in this whole development is something about the material shape of thought's expression. Art is a matter of form and content, because in some sense actively works through the relation between thought or meaning and its material expression. We should expect Hegel's aesthetics to be an account of the arts in their plasticity, that is, among other things, continuously concerned to test the shapes it examines against the forms of discursive and literary sense they enable. And this is, I believe, the actual work of Hegel's lecture, including, although I won't spend any time on it, the rather difficult role literature plays within them. The lectures that follow will flesh out and transform this diagram in various ways. Here's one summary version, as we move more deeply into both Hegel's argument and into particular bodies of work. But for today, I don't want to move far from the questions of reading Hegel and of reading in Hegel, as they are necessarily at work in Hegel's imagination of art. So I want to close by offering some measure of how things might stand now between us and Hegel. Let's say, provisionally, that our sculpture now looks like this. What do we imagine Hegel might make of this? Orozco's social fact is evidently not the Greek's fact. This is, one supposes, an invitation to improvise a game, to find some kind of passing attunement on the occasion of something that draws on a set of tools and conventions that are at once familiar and estranged. Can we say, should Hegel say, that this is as fully plastic, as fully self-shaped and given over to externality as he imagines his Greek sculptures have been, to the point that we can take them as readings of that classical moment from within a modernity that knows it can no longer be centered that way? And should we then say not that it doesn't in its own way make a center of itself, but it takes that centrality to be nonetheless traversed or worked by a kind of separation or incompleteness or momentariness that renders its shape difficult, hard to grasp? Say it imagines being a center as more like being a knot than a point, and like a knot it doesn't stand entirely without relation. How do the works on the wall belong or not belong to ping-pong table? Does it have tying and untying among its possibilities? The sociability it imagines and realizes is a matter not of immediate sharing, but of something like conversation or exchange or invention. In standing this way as sculpture, it would say something about how we, now or still, stand with reading, in its midst, not yet done, still in need of its full discovery. We might then say that ours is a time in which philosophy and art alike are, in their highest vocation, as Hegel puts it, impossible, and so a time in which they are obliged to find and lose themselves in one another, measuring and testing the continuing necessity of thought at grips with its own materiality. This would be the condition of Hegel's actual exposure to us, his availability to our reading. Hegel is often said to be the first major philosopher to have modernity as an explicit object and problem. The French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy revises this interestingly, I think. Opening his little book, Hegel, The Restlessness of the Negative, he writes that Hegel is the inaugural thinker of the contemporary world. What this small change means, I believe, to underline is that the modern world is not something that simply lies before Hegel, but is a matter of a temporality to which his writing, and so also his reading, is essentially exposed. To read Hegel now is to unfold a shared and divided time. We do not, Nancy says, here claim to restore Hegel, nor to expound an Hegelianism. We read Hegel, or we think him such as he has already been read or rethought up to us, such as he has already been played out in thought, and of course, I will add, in art.